Joining me now for more on those Supreme Court decisions is California Democratic Congresswoman Judy Chu. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us on this holiday week. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with where I left off with Kelly O'Donnell, which is that President Biden has made this promise to take steps to address the issue of student loan forgiveness. Obviously, there are still going to be hurdles, as Kelly just mapped out. How confident are you that he is going to be able to follow through with the promises of actually getting relief to millions of Americans?
Well, I give credit to President Biden in starting very early on when he could anticipate what the court decision might be. And he is already taking steps to reduce the loan payment from 10% to 5% of a student's income, and then having a process by which they can moderate the way that loan payments are made through a new rule. They are looking at loan forgiveness for low-income students. So these are things that can provide relief. But I do think that considering the fact that the student loan moratorium will lift as of September, many students are worried about what will happen to them. And they were looking towards the student debt relief as a way of being able to make ends meet in the fall. So I think it's a huge disappointment to millions of Americans. I am glad that President Biden is doing what he can, but it wouldn't have been as immediate as student debt relief.
And I guess the question for these students as they watch and wait to see what happens next is, why should they have confidence that the president's actions now are going to be successful when he was just blocked by the Supreme Court?
He has lawyers that are looking at the viability of these particular actions, so they are being very careful. I have confidence that they are taking steps that will be upheld by the legal system, and that they are steps that are within his purview that can be done. They are taking into account the way that these loan payments are made. I think even though those are more moderate steps, I think they are certainly within his jurisdiction.
You know, it was interesting. The president was asked on Friday why he gave students false hope that they would get this student loan relief. He denied that that's what he was doing. But do you think he offered false hope to students with these executive orders?
I believe he did what the public needed. The public was calling for student debt relief, and we heard this over and over again. And we saw that with the moratorium on payments, there was tremendous relief among students, and you know, it was for the last few years during COVID. So I think it was a natural outgrowth of that to have a student debt relief. And he did what was in his conscience, and also what would help the economy, because then these students would be able to live on with their lives and inject these funds into the economy. And let's not forget that college costs have increased 3 times since 1980, and yet wages have not kept up with it.
Congresswoman, the president was asked about the court. He said it was not a normal court. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you worry that attacking the court could further undermine people's confidence in our nation's institutions?
I totally agree that this is not a normal court. This is an extremist right-wing court. They overturned 50 years of precedent under the Dobbs decision. They overturned 50 years of precedent on the affirmative action decision. They are not paying attention to precedent, despite what Justice Kavanaugh said in his Supreme Court hearing. So, no, this is not a normal court, and I think there has to be change. I think that the public is losing confidence in the Supreme Court as a checks and balance to our system in America.
President Biden has consistently said he is opposed to court packing, what's called court packing, adding more seats to the Supreme Court. Where are you on that issue in the wake of these latest rulings? Would you consider it at this point?
Well, I'm actually a co-sponsor on the bill that would increase the number of justices from 9 to 13. In my research, I was really surprised to learn that the number of justices is not set in the Constitution, and that prior to the Civil War, it had actually been increased and decreased over a number of times. And finally, in the 1860s, it remained about 9 justices. But there is nothing that says that it must be at that number. And I think now is the time to change it, with this court being appointed under such terrible conditions where, for instance, one justice actually lied when he said that he would respect precedent.
But Congresswoman,
so, yeah.
I guess the counter to that is, where would it end? Because if you add more seats to the court now and Republicans are able to add more seats at some point further down the line, where does it end? And does it not then actually become a completely politicized court?
Well, it could, but here is what I say. I say that now the discussion is really increasing about changes to the Supreme Court. And there is another proposal, actually, that I support, which is term limits. Term limits of 18 years would certainly be sufficient for any Supreme Court justice, and also ensure that every Supreme Court justice would be in good health. So I think that that is also a viable alternative. Whatever the solutions are, there clearly needs to be some Supreme Court reform.
Congresswoman, let me get your take on the Supreme Court's decision to strike down affirmative action in higher education. It has been knocked down in your state of California. You're a former educator, we should point out. Statistics show that Latinos, who make up 40% of your state's population, only make up 22.5% of students enrolled in UC schools. African Americans make up 6.5%, even though, and then they make up much less of the population of schools. How confident are you that these universities who say we are still dedicated to diversifying will be able to achieve that, will be able to meet their own self-imposed goals?
Well, I really have to give credit to the UC-NCSU systems, because they did the most that they could to do outreach to communities of color to ensure that they would enroll. And they've actually made tremendous progress since then. But I do have to say that right after the decision striking down affirmative action in California, half of the population of Blacks and Latinos declined in the UC system.
So do you worry about that nationwide, Congresswoman? Do you worry about that nationwide? Because these schools say that, look, they are still dedicated to diversifying their student population. Do you think they'll be able to do that?
I definitely worry about that. I do think that there is great intentions. I have talked to the presidents of these very elite universities. However, I do think that there is going to be inevitably a decline, especially in the immediacy after this decision.
Congresswoman, very quickly before I let you go, when when affirmative action was signed into law, it was imagined as something that would last for 25 years. You have former Vice President Mike Pence saying there may have been a time when affirmative action was necessary simply to open the doors of all our schools and universities, but I think that time has passed. What do you make of that perspective?
Well, can we say that discrimination has ended in this country? I mean, look. There has been 3 years of anti-Asian hate. We've seen hate crimes on the rise in this country. We have seen very polarized kinds of actions taken against communities of color. No, discrimination has not ended in this country, and there are great disparities. Even amongst AAPIs, we see great disparities in education between those on the high end and Pacific Islanders, as well as Southeast Asians, who have very low numbers with regard to completing a college degree. So no, discrimination has not ended in this country, and there are many, many ways in which we could show it.
All right. Congresswoman Judy Chu, thank you so much. We hope you have a wonderful holiday. Appreciate your joining us.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.